They say even in death, he feared rebellion. When the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, ordered the construction of his tomb, he demanded that it be more than a resting place. It had to be a universe of power, sealed in silence for eternity. Beneath the red dust of Xi'an, over 7,000 life-size warriors stand guard, each face different, as if breathing. But behind their stoic gaze lies a truth soaked in blood and sorrow. The workers who built this colossal necropolis, farmers, artisans, slaves, were never meant to leave. When the last stone was laid, the gates were closed and thousands were buried alive with their creation. It is a story of madness disguised as glory, of a ruler who sought immortality, yet drowned in his own fear of death. A man who unified a nation through fire and cruelty, and who, even in his grave, refused to release his grip on life. Before we descend into the shadows of the emperor's tomb, don't forget to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. Follow us for more true stories of empires, betrayals, and the haunting echoes of history that refuse to die. The boy who would one day call himself the first emperor was born amid blood and betrayal. Ying entered the world in 259 BCE, during China's Warring States period, a time when 7 rival kingdoms tore each other apart for dominance. His father was the king of Qin, a state known for its brutal discipline and iron rule. His mother, a woman of ambition and scandal, became the subject of palace whispers long before the boy could walk. From his earliest days, Zheng's world was one of daggers behind curtains, of poisoned cups and trembling servants. When he ascended the throne at just 13, the court saw only a child. But within that child burned something dark and unrelenting, a will to unite the fractured lands under one name, one law, one throne. He grew into a ruler who trusted no one, who believed loyalty could be bought with terror. Ministers were executed at the slightest hint of deceit, and scholars were buried alive for daring to question his decrees. Order through fear, he declared, and the world obeyed. Yet even as he conquered the kingdoms of Zhao, Wei, Chu, and Yan, turning a nation of warlords into an empire, the emperor's victories could not silence the whisper of death. Late at night, when the palace lanterns flickered and the mountains outside Xi'an turned to shadow, he would summon his astrologers. They would speak of omens, of stars that shifted, of rivers that turned red, of ghosts that refused to sleep. Qin Shi Huang listened in silence, his eyes distant, his pulse steady. For though he had conquered the world, he knew he had not conquered time. It was said he often stared into polished bronze mirrors, searching not for his reflection, but for signs of decay, the faint wrinkle, the trembling hand, the reminder that even emperors rot. That fear became his obsession. Immortality was no longer a fantasy. It was a mission ordained by heaven itself. He ordered the court's finest alchemists to scour the empire for elixirs of eternal life. Across the seas, emissaries sailed toward mythical islands where gods were said to dwell, carrying gifts of jade and gold. None returned, and as each failed promise reached his ears, the emperor's paranoia deepened. He began to suspect that death itself was plotting against him. The emperor's obsession soon became the empire's burden. In every province, whispers spread of strange men in white robes, alchemists carrying jade flasks and vials of shimmering liquid, claiming to hold the secret of eternal life. They spoke of mountains that touched the heavens, where mortals walked barefoot among clouds, and the dew itself granted immortality. Qin Shi Huang believed them all. He poured vast fortunes into their pursuits, sending ships to distant seas and building temples to house their experiments. But each elixir was poison. Each promise turned to ash. In his desperation, the emperor consumed mercury pills said to purify the blood and preserve the soul. They dulled his mind, but fed his delusion. He began to dream of God speaking through storms, of celestial beings who demanded monuments in his honor. Every failure only hardened his resolve. If heaven denies me eternity, he said, then I shall build it myself. Night after night, the courtiers trembled as his demands grew monstrous. Farmers were seized from their fields. Artisans were forced into endless labor. The emperor's dream of immortality transformed into something darker, a hunger to outlast life itself through stone, metal, and fear. The Great Wall rose from that madness, a scar across the land, built not just to defend his empire, but to mark it forever upon the earth. Yet no wall could keep out death. It lingered behind every shadow, every silent corridor of the palace. The emperor's attendant spoke of his sleepless nights, his eyes wide and glassy, haunted by unseen figures. He ordered his chambers sealed from wind, fearing spirits might slip through the cracks. His empire bowed beneath the weight of his terror, and still he searched for a way to silence the truth that stalked him in every reflection. When the emperor finally accepted that the gods would not grant him immortality, he resolved to steal eternity by human hands. Deep beneath Mount Li, where mist clung to the slopes like shrouds, he ordered the construction of his tomb, a city of the dead that would mirror the heavens. It would not merely house his body, but his empire itself. Rivers of mercury to mimic flowing seas, jeweled ceilings painted with constellations, bronze palaces guarded by an army of stone. "Let the world above rot," he declared. "Below I will reign forever." Hundreds of thousands were summoned to fulfill his command. Peasants, prisoners, artisans, and slaves, each one a thread in the great tapestry of his delusion. The roads leading to Mount Li thundered with footsteps and cries. Men dug until their hands split and bled. Women carried baskets of earth until their backs bent like bows. Overseers with whips ensured no one faltered. The air filled with dust and the sound of chisels striking stone. Day after endless day, those who worked closest to the burial chamber spoke of tunnels so vast they could swallow temples whole. They whispered of mercury rivers glinting like molten silver, of traps set to kill intruders even after 1,000 years. And always there was a smell, the metallic tang of sweat and soil, the stench of fear clinging to every breath. As the tomb grew, it devoured lives. Workers vanished without trace, sealed behind the walls they had built. None dared speak of it openly, but everyone knew the emperor's resting place would not be shared with the living. Under the shadow of Mount Li, the line between creation and grave blurred. Each strike of the hammer was a heartbeat closer to silence. The emperor rarely visited the site himself, but his presence haunted every stone. Messengers arrived from the palace bearing new decrees: expand the chambers, raise the walls higher, carve new tunnels to reach the core. The overseers obeyed with trembling hands. They knew that to fail the emperor was to vanish without a trace. The tomb became its own empire, governed by silence and fear. At night, when torches flickered against the cavern walls, some workers claimed to hear cries echoing through the tunnels, voices that did not belong to the living. Others swore they saw shadows moving in the dark, hands that reached from the soil as if trying to escape. But superstition meant nothing to the foreman. The emperor's was law, and the law demanded progress. As the years passed, the workers began to change. Their eyes dulled, their bodies wasted away. Some tried to flee down the mountain paths, only to be hunted by imperial guards. Their corpses were hung at the gates as a warning. The living learned that mercy had no place in the emperor's vision of eternity. He sought perfection, even in death, and perfection required sacrifice. When the final chambers were sealed, the artisans wept, not for the beauty they had created, but for those who would never see the sun again. Legend says that once the tomb was complete, the gates were closed and the exits buried. Thousands of laborers were trapped inside, their screams fading as the soil reclaimed them. Only silence remained, a silence so thick it seemed to hum beneath the ground. Above, the emperor's banners waved in triumph. Below, an empire of bones began its eternal vigil. Before the tomb was sealed, the emperor demanded one final creation, an army that would follow him into eternity, not of flesh and blood, but of clay and fire. They would stand eternal watch over his soul, defending him against the ghosts of those he had slain. So began the crafting of the Terracotta army, the most haunting masterpiece in human history. Across the plains of Xi'an, workshops rose like small cities. Kilns burned day and night, filling the air with the sharp scent of scorched earth and molten bronze. Thousands of sculptors labored in silence, shaping warriors from the mud of the Yellow River. Each face was unique, stern, weary, defiant, like the men who once marched under his banner. No two eyes looked the same, as if every soldier carried a fragment of forgotten soul. Armor was carved with obsessive precision, etched with patterns reserved for generals and foot soldiers alike. Bronze swords were forged, arrows fletched, chariots assembled with wooden wheels and lacquered reins. Even horses were molded, their nostrils flared, their muscles straining, as if caught mid-gallop. The emperor's vision demanded not statues, but life, frozen on the edge of motion, suspended between breath and death. The artisans whispered among themselves that each warrior required an offering. Some mixed ashes of the dead into the clay, believing it would grant the figure's strength. Others buried their fingerprints deep within the sculpted hands, a silent act of rebellion, proof that their existence would endure even if their bodies did not. When rows of soldiers began to fill the tunnels, the workers stood in awe. An army stretched into the darkness, endless and unyielding. And still, the emperor was not satisfied. As the Terracotta army grew, so too did its silence. Thousands of warriors now stood beneath the earth, archers, generals, charioteers, all facing east, as if awaiting a call to war that would never come. Their painted faces once glimmered with color, but the years of torch smoke had dulled them into shades of ash. To those who walked among them, it felt less like art and more like judgment. The emperor visited the site once, cloaked and surrounded by guards. He moved slowly through the ranks of his earthen soldiers, saying nothing. Torches flickered across the hollow eyes of the clay faces, and for a moment, even he seemed uncertain whether they were watching him or condemning him. "They will guard me for 10,000 years, he whispered. His voice trembled, not from pride, but from fear of what might come after those years had passed. Rumor spread that the artisans who crafted the army would soon share its fate. The emperor could not allow anyone to reveal the secrets of his tomb, the hidden traps, the rivers of mercury, the sleeping army beneath the mountain. One by one, the sculptors vanished. Some say they were executed in silence. Others claim they were sealed inside with their creations, their breath mixing with the clay they shaped. When the final chamber was filled, torches were extinguished, and darkness swallowed the warriors whole. The entrance was buried beneath layers of earth, erasing the line between life and death, between man and God. Centuries would pass before anyone would see their faces again. Until then, the Terracotta Guardians stood unmoving in eternal formation, loyal, lifeless, and waiting for an emperor who would never wake. By the time the tomb neared completion, the emperor's body had begun to fail him. His once commanding voice grew thin. His hands trembled when he reached the scroll's estate, and his eyes, once sharp as steel, were clouded by the fog of poison. The alchemists, desperate to appease him, continued to feed him mercury-laced elixirs, insisting that pain was merely proof of purification. Each sip burned his throat, but he drank, believing eternity demanded suffering. He no longer trusted the living. Ministers were executed for imagined treason. Servants were flogged for speaking his name without bowing. He slept in different chambers each night, terrified that assassins lurked in the shadows. His court had become a theater of whispers, where every breath might be betrayal. Outside the palace walls, famine spread through the empire. Farmers abandoned their lands to escape conscription, and soldiers deserted in droves. The great peace he had built through terror was beginning to unravel. In the summer of 210 BCE, the emperor embarked on what would be his final journey, a tour of his empire to inspect the lands he claimed were eternal. He traveled with an army of guards, a convoy of carriages, and the few ministers he still trusted. They say he gazed at the mountains with suspicion, as though the stones themselves plotted against him. Nights were restless. He dreamed of rivers turning to blood, of faceless figures dragging him beneath black waters. Then, somewhere near the coast, his body gave out. The court physicians called it exhaustion, but all knew the truth. The elixirs had rotted him from within. The emperor who had sought immortality had swallowed his own death. Still, his ministers could not allow the world to know. When Qin Shi Huang collapsed inside his carriage, silence fell upon the imperial convoy. No one dared to speak the word dead. To admit it was treason, to confess that heaven itself had abandoned the son of heaven. His chief minister, Li Si, stood trembling before the emperor's lifeless form, realizing the empire's fate now hung by a single lie. If the people learned their god-king was gone, rebellion would ignite like dry grass. So the court decided the emperor would live, at least in name. His death was hidden beneath ceremony and deceit. Orders continued to flow in his name, sealed with his jade insignia. Food was brought to his carriage as if he still dined, though none entered to serve him. The smell of decay soon began to seep through the curtains, thick and sour in the summer heat. To mask it, attendants filled the air with carts of salted fish, their stench overpowering the scent of death. For weeks, the convoy rolled through valleys and mountains, carrying a corpse wrapped in imperial silks. Guards marched with bowed heads, unwilling to glance toward the sealed carriage. Even the horses grew restless, sensing something unnatural beside them. At night, when the wind shifted, some swore they heard the faint rustle of movement from within, as though the emperor himself resisted his own mortality. By the time they reached the capital, Li Si's face had aged 10 years. He announced that the emperor was ill and must rest in seclusion. Only later, when the tomb at Mount Liand opened to receive him, did the truth quietly take its place beside the lie. The man who sought eternity had finally been delivered to it, alone, buried beneath the empire he had built on fear. Centuries passed before the earth above Mount Li stirred again. The emperor's dynasty, once proclaimed eternal, crumbled within years of his death. Rebels stormed the palaces, flames devoured the scrolls that bore his laws, and his descendants vanished into the shadows of history. Yet beneath the soil, his kingdom of silence endured, untouched, unseen, waiting. The tomb itself remained sealed, shrouded in legend. Ancient texts spoke of rivers of mercury flowing around his sarcophagus, of jeweled ceilings that mirrored the stars, and of crossbows set to fire at any intruder. No emperor dared to disturb it, for fear that breaking the seal would unleash the curse of the first emperor's wrath. The mountain became a wound in the landscape, a place of whispers and dread. Locals avoided it at dusk, claiming they heard the clash of unseen armies echoing beneath the ground. For 2,000 years, the emperor's afterlife lay in darkness. Then, in 1974, farmers digging a well near Xi'an struck something hard beneath their shovels. What they uncovered was not a relic, but a resurrection. Clay faces emerged from the dust, each one staring back with lifelike eyes, as the earth itself remembered its master. News of the Terracotta army spread across the world, and scholars realized that legend had not lied. The first emperor's ghost had left behind an empire of stone, but the tomb itself remains untouched, its core undisturbed. Scientists fear that opening it might destroy what lies within, or release the mercury that still poisons the soil above. The emperor still lies there, encased in silence, surrounded by the army that was built to protect him from eternity itself. Even in death, his grip on the world has never fully loosened. Today, the first emperor's legacy endures not through mercy or wisdom, but through awe and unease. Tourists walk among the ranks of his clay soldiers, gazing into faces that seem almost human, yet disturbingly hollow. Each figure carries the weight of an untold story, of the hands that shaped it, of the cries that once echoed to the tunnels where it stood. The sight has become a wonder of the world, but beneath its grandeur lingers a question that no one can answer. Was this monument built to honor life or to imprison death? Archaeologists who have studied the tomb describe it as both a miracle and a warning. The precision of its construction defies comprehension. Yet every discovery peels back another layer of cruelty. The mercury rivers remain lethal even today. The soil around Mount Li is still poisoned by his desire to endure. Some historians believe that the emperor succeeded in his own way, not in living forever, but in being remembered. His name endures, whispered across millennia, etched into the clay of 10,000 faces. Immortality, after all, is not the absence of death, but the refusal to be forgotten. And yet, when one stands before the silent army, it is not triumph that fills the air, it is sorrow. The warriors, frozen in eternal formation, are both his protectors and his prisoners. Their creator lies somewhere beneath them, sealed in darkness, his dream of eternity now a tomb that breathes. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of Qin Shi Huang, a reminder that no empire, no monument, no ambition, no matter how vast, can escape the stillness of the grave. For even the emperor who conquered death was ultimately conquered by time.